Hi there. Today I'm sitting down with Saagar at Northlane Partners, a consultancy firm that's helping fast growing companies to really nail their pricing strategy and scale the implementation of their pricing with confidence. Today we're going to dive into some of the tactical pricing questions that come up for Saagar's team and really also talk about how AI business models have necessitated pricing changes and the broader implications for this for sales, RevOps, and the finance function. So Saagar, do you want to briefly introduce yourself and tell us what Northlane does?
Absolutely. Thanks, Ria, for having me. Yeah, so as you said, Northlane is a boutique pricing strategy firm. We're working closely with VC-backed and fast-growing startups and scale-ups. And yeah, our reason for being is basically twofold. One is AI monetization is really rewriting the playbook for how, the SaaS world used to work. And we love being part of that. We love learning with teams, but most importantly, we love enabling those teams to actually put into practice something which is a very complex but yet high growth lever for their business. And the second side of this, in the second tailwind behind us, is really the new world of consulting itself. So our belief is that we need to practice what we preach. So our operating model internally is also using AI. We have internal co-pilots, and our team is full of senior operators who have seen it and done it on the other side of the table, not just kind of writing slides as advisors. That has enabled us to provide a really execution focused delivery model, and one that startups especially seem to really like in terms of the speed of iteration and the dynamism with which we work and collaborate. So those are the two kind of key principles which we're based on. And yeah, we love the energy. And for the last 3 years, we've built some great momentum and long.
Great. Well, let's dive straight in. So, you talked about kind of AI monetization and sort of rewriting the pricing playbook. Obviously, we've seen an incredible surge in AI companies in the last year and a real kind of shift in how these companies think about their business models. So maybe like just, starting out the gates, what is actually different about AI pricing versus maybe the last decade of usage-based
Yeah.
pricing or the last decade of SaaS pricing?
Yeah.
Genuinely new or just rebranded? What are you seeing there?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great question. I do think there's a bit of both. We think a lot of the same principles still apply in terms of value-based pricing versus cost-based pricing, et cetera, et cetera. I think one subtle change is within SaaS, we always used to take it as almost gospel that seats were the way in which prices would scale between different customers. And the thing that you would absolutely focus on is what we call packaging. So that's how you, think about features within your product, so capabilities within your product. And those are the things which you can think of as binary, things you can turn on and off. And those areas are where we used to spend most of our time thinking about what is the customer journey, how do they move through these packages, what is their entry point, and how do you communicate value based on the package back out to the market and the ICP you're trying to target. Now, that bit is still super important, and I'm sure at some point we'll talk about how AI features themselves kind of find themselves in those packages. But the key thing we're seeing is that, seats are no longer the default. We don't believe that it's kind of completely gone away. And again, we can talk about that as one of the key principles. We don't believe it's completely gone away. But because AI can lead you towards such tangible results, we're seeing more of a shift away from seats and more towards outputs and productive work that your AI and AI agents can do. We used to think about packaging, the price metric, the price model, and then the price levels. These days, we talk about price metric first, because we really want to understand the unit of value that is actually driving outcomes and outputs for the customer. Second part of that is just to say that, we're no longer in the SaaS world where it was, again, default that you could command 80%, 90% margins in whatever action that you do. We're in this world where, model costs are absolutely non-negligible. Your best customers, your power users, are probably the ones that are hurting your margins the most.
Hmm.
And these kind of dynamics really force you to think about the pricing model as well. And, things like limits, throttling, etc., are really, really much more in focus than they would have been in the old world.
Super, super interesting and kind of comprehensive overview. Maybe just to dive into a couple of points you raised there. So thinking about price metrics first,
Mm.
I don't know, do you have any kind of real world examples of that or scenarios where you've seen a traditional SaaS company shift their pricing? And
Yeah. So look, one of the coolest examples on it was in vogue at the time as well was Intercom and Fin and how they moved towards a kind of more per resolution pricing system with
Mhm.
their AI agent. And that was actually a real like pioneering move. That was a big company, a big technology player, like going and signaling that no longer does it make sense for us to charge based on seats. And we have this opportunity to become truly value based. You only pay when you get an outcome that your customers are satisfied with. So in a
and
lot of
in that
ways, yeah,
scenario,
yeah,
was that kind of that outcome-based pricing that they moved
yeah,
towards
yeah.
entirely kind of displacing their original packages, or did they manage to kind of fit those AI products within those kind of initial packages that they designed?
Yeah, so that's a great point. So the storyline still has to work on top of their existing product, right? It's not either or. They need to put everything within the context of what they were doing before. And this is a key difference that we're seeing. SaaS companies that are becoming SaaS plus AI companies are on a different journey to AI native companies. And that is a super important piece. And, the billing and the kind of ecosystem that sits around that is really interesting to unpack because you can't just forget about the golden goose that has brought you to where you are. You need to innovate and you need to push forward new models, but that creates complexity inherently within
Mhm.
within the way that they do their pricing and the pricing infrastructure that sits underneath it. So yeah, these big SaaS players that are now pivoting towards AI, they have a big challenge because ultimately there's this big transition that needs to happen to
Mhm.
make sure that both models can stay alive.
And so I guess kind of on that point of infrastructure limitations, a couple
Mm,
of things I'm really curious on. The first is kind of like, where have you seen limitations with incumbent subscription billing tools that
mm,
customers, that your clients are using,
mm,
that, worked maybe fine in their old seat-based pricing scenarios, but don't
yeah,
necessarily traverse to some of the
yeah,
new pricing models they're adopting? And actually, like,
yeah,
in line with that, what is the lift involved for these companies
yeah,
implementing consumption-based pricing? What is some of the kind of infrastructure pieces that they need to think about,
yeah.
from data warehouse to tracking and
Mm.
ultimately really kind of operationalizing that new pricing model?
Yeah, I think the new default is customization, right? So even in the SaaS world where, seemingly things were quite simple, and especially looking back now, it seems simple in terms of the way you'd architect pricing infrastructure, you'd still have customizations. Like in the companies that I worked with and for, like we would have endless like custom prices and custom deals within our CPQ, and even that was a Frankenstein to handle. So now in the new world, you got to think about folks that are moving towards more usage style pricing or what we call consumption based pricing, i.e., paying in arrears of the actual action, being able to track those things from a telemetry point of view, and then have that feed to an accurate kind of billing model. A super, super difficult piece for you to orient your existing subscription or billing system into. The other side of that is, and it's a common thing that when we work with slightly older age traditional SaaS companies, the point around seats and like how far off their limit they are. So let's imagine they permission 50 seats, they're actually at 55. There's a lot of companies that used to just leave money on the table because they couldn't figure out the billing infrastructure or didn't have the tracking technology to actually notice that they're 5 seats over. That problem is now accentuated when the full revenue model is based on the precise tracking of where that usage is. So ultimately, the telemetry piece is super important, and linking that into whatever quote to cash type of system that you have, and linking those two together is super important. And the final thing I would say is that, we're still in a world where trying to get AI adoption, especially if you are a new company, is difficult. So we're going to get to a world where, giving 100 units, 100 credits, 100 actions of free usage to try and ramp up and get adoption within your customer is super important, right? But that's not going to be forever. And you want to kind of transition them onto the default plans that you have as soon as possible. So those kind of, promotional elements need to still fit into the billing model, and the ability to customize at kind of a customer level is going to be even more important as you try and get mind share of your new AI product.
Yeah, it's a great point. Actually, a big part of the reason we see companies coming to Sequence to switch billing
Yeah.
provider is often the implementation of usage-based pricing or credit pricing. Often it's also because, to your point, they're not currently able to capture those overages on
Yeah.
seats. they
Yeah.
contract for something, but actually seat numbers grow through the life cycle of that contract. And
Yeah.
they're frankly just leaving a pretty significant amount of revenue on the table.
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes companies can underestimate the importance of like having infrastructure in place, having an order to cash system in place that actually meets the requirements of your pricing model. And frankly, the iteration that's inevitably going to ensue in your pricing model.
Mhm.
Change pricing frequently and not, have to sort of rebuild your billing engine or have to kind of create a ton of workarounds around whatever you're using.
Exactly. Exactly. The workarounds kill you, right? You can't scale from that perspective. If you have so many workarounds that you don't really have a system anymore, then that's your issue.
Absolutely. And you talked a bit about burn down credits and actually,
Yeah.
offering somebody a credit package that's free to start with is a great way to start driving adoption of an AI
Mm.
product. What do you typically see in companies that, will use credits with burn down as their default model versus, just a pure sort of usage-based pricing model where
Yeah.
they're in arrears with no
Yeah.
usage limit set?
Yeah.
How do you help companies decision between those two options?
Yeah. So the drawdown model is what we would call a hybrid model. So if you think of two different models, one is a subscription where you pay some sort of commissioning. And then there's the consumption model where you're paying in arrears after each action. What the credits model or general burn down slash drawdown type models give you is this upfront committed volume, which is like a subscription. And then as you go over that limit, you then start to move on to a consumption based model where it actually moves with the usage.
And do
So
you and do you
yeah.
find for your clients that have these overages, so once you've drawn down on that initial credit package and
Mhm.
you start incurring overages, does that create friction with their end customers where it essentially means a lack of predictability in what their kind of monthly invoice is going to be?
Yeah, so I think there's more unpredictability in a pure consumption model, right?
Mhm.
So again, this is where this hybrid piece, it really like tries to balance both worlds. I think our key principle when we work with our clients is like, how do your customers want to buy, right? If you're selling into a big, old school company, they're looking to kind of lock in 3-year TCV. They want predictability in their costs. And honestly, we believe they probably pay a premium net on that predictability,
Yeah,
right? But an early stage company, they're much more willing to kind of, fluctuate up and down. The revenue model and the business model is all in flux anyway, day to
right.
day. And they're happy to say, hey, if we use more this month and we use less this month, that's great. That works with our operating model. Really about balancing your model and having the flexibility within your model to meet
Mhm.
your customers where they are. And
Yeah.
that's something that we're seeing more and more. You don't know, especially at the PMF stage, like where are you going to actually find your first crowd? And you need to have both options open, and that's where these kind of credits models and hybrid models like really help allow you to keep all options open at the start.
And one thing I'd love to touch on a little bit is, outcome-based pricing. You referenced it
Yeah,
with Intercom and Fin, very kind of hot buzzword in the industry
yeah,
right
yeah,
now. And, like theoretically really makes sense that you're
yeah,
charging based on outcomes that you deliver for customers as like, a really strong kind of value alignment piece there. But one thing I find interesting is, if you look at the ad industry, the kind of pay per conversion
yeah,
model that was deployed there, really, which is kind of an equivalent of outcomes-based pricing, that model never really won. Most spend is still, CPM or CPC.
yeah,
And I guess one question I have is how much success are you seeing AI companies actually have with outcome-based
yeah,
pricing? And are we going to just repeat the same 20-year cycle and,
yeah, yeah.
fail for the same reasons?
So, from my perspective, we're quite clear on this when we again work with our clients. So there's a difference in terms of these usage-based metrics. We put them in kind of three buckets. One is the super like technical side of things. When you're more on the infrastructure layer and things are a bit more cost plus. So this is like compute, CPU, data processing, et cetera, et cetera. Then there's what we would call input metrics, which are effectively saying like how much work, how much effort is your product doing, right?
Mhm.
And that could be, interactions, it could be clicks, it could be tasks, et cetera, et cetera. Where the intercom version comes in is what we call outputs, right? So it's not just measuring effort, it's measuring productive work done. Like this is stuff where you're like, hey, if it was a person doing this, then this would be, hey, like, good job, right? You found something that was great and something good happened at the end of
Mhm.
it. Customer had their resolution and they were happy with it. You did a cost conversion client, like a converted whatever execution within your workflow, et cetera, et cetera. So where I think that stops and outcome starts is an actually interesting thing. So we think that's output style pricing.
Yeah.
Outcome style pricing is actually still one step removed and is even more aspirational. This is essentially saying like it's like a finder's fee, no win, no fee type of
Hmm.
stuff, right? It's saying that if I make you 100 grand, then I'm going to take 10% of that. Now, the only companies that can really do that well are the ones whose products are placed directly next to either a cost output or a revenue output, right? Or a
Hmm.
core business outcome that you can tangibly say and quantify. So, good example, Chargeflow, for example, they're doing cool stuff, which is like, getting back different payments that have been lost and
Hmm.
things like that. And effectively, that's brilliant for outcome-based pricing because you say, hey, if I don't get this for you, you lose this money. So I've literally brought you whatever amount of money and I'll take 10%, founder's
Yeah.
fee, whatever,
Yeah.
whatever that number is. But those kind of models work really well. The only industry where we've seen this work seamlessly is the payments industry because there's a closed loop on who gets what and where that percentage of
Hmm.
attribution happens.
Yeah.
The moment you have to go and say, hey, yeah, we closed you 5 deals. So we know that your revenue increased by 1 million that year. Therefore, we think we impacted, 20% and then we take 10%, et cetera, and do all that maths. You say
Right.
that to a CRO, they'll say, no, I'm out here celebrating that we did 150% on quota, not giving you your kind of what you think you earned. As soon as you go into these attribution style conversations, it's going to become really tough. So that's one where I say, and our internal view is always price and the kind of have the conversation around ROI and outcomes.
Hmm.
But directly configuring price based on a business case that's 2 steps away from an actual revenue or cost outcome is still going to be super difficult unless you're in the closed loop position that the payments industry, for example, is in.
So now turning a little bit to the actual kind of operational execution
Yeah.
in a company. Who owns pricing? Pricing used to be maybe decided in a small room. Now we have
Yeah.
finance, CS, sales, all have input. There's a growing place for well-defined RevOps function in many
Yeah.
companies quite early in the life cycle. How do you see this? Well,
Exactly as you say, it's just this super cross-functional topic that touches on product, sales, finance, customer success, and basically the strategic vision of the business as well. So typically seed, Series A, even early Series B, we tend to see the CEO really actually as the one that's the exec sponsor, if not actually the ongoing kind of operational lead of this kind of work, purely because they're the only one that can zoom out and look at all of the different things happening and take decisions based on that. Where we do see that maybe one step moved is that kind of chief of staff, founders associate type of role where, they're the right or left hand of the CEO. And basically they have that kind of exposure to the executive, but realistically they could be a bit more operational, have their ears in more meetings and more places. But typically where we see kind of the key contributors of this are haven't changed so much from kind of what we used to see in the SaaS world. It's kind of product marketing, for example, who, understand the value, the competitive positioning, understand what the customer is kind of actually seeing within the product that we need to highlight and could potentially charge more for. There's then RevOps who own the kind of understanding of, how the sales process is happening, where we need to kind of potentially discount more, what we need to track, and then ultimately the downstream effects of things like compensation, sales comp,
mhm,
biz ops stuff in terms of like what we're tracking and what are the KPIs that we need to think about. And then, the billing, invoicing, CPQ stuff that needs to happen behind that. Then there's finance, basically, which are having an elevated role, I would say, in the AI world, purely because, again, margin is now back on the table for pricing
tell me
strategy,
about
which,
that. Tell me a bit more about
yeah,
that elevated role
yeah,
where
yeah,
finance getting involved, not just in pricing strategy, but actually, are you seeing the sort of deal desk evolve as well
yeah.
to
So
have the
it's a
finance?
really interesting point that is the key thing that we believe has changed in this world. So gross margin used to be something that we didn't really care about from the perspective of discounting, right? You sold a 10K deal. Oh, if we had to discount that by 10%, then you know what? To get the deal done, we believe there's strategic growth potential in this deal, blah, blah, blah. Now, if you do that, you might have been in a world where the 10 grand deal is actually at 40% margin. So all of a sudden, you've sunk that to lower 40, 30, 20% by that discount. So the deal desk role is no longer just on, hey, should we discount the ARR? They are now the guardians of the guardrails against gross margin of keeping your business alive. So that's now the point. And I think there's another point, broader point about the finance role, which is to say, it really, really is a lot more customer friendly to focus on things that your product is doing and achieving for your customers. So outputs, inputs, et cetera, et cetera. Those models are inherently harder to predict, harder to forecast, et cetera, et cetera. So there's operational challenges that would fall in the lap of the CFO. So their power is actually heightened as being the enabler of the strategic shift, because they could easily say, hey guys, we're not going for this because I can't predict it, we can't forecast it, et cetera, et cetera. Do they really have a decision to make? Do they want to kind of help us drive towards this world? Or are they going to say and stay, hey, look, I don't know what to tell the board when we kind of change this model, so it's a non-starter. So it's a really interesting world that we're in, that the CFOs now, because of this margin piece, because of this unpredictability that comes with consumption-based pricing, they're going to be the guardians of whether this gathers momentum or really whether it stops in its tracks.
And so, like, what advice would you give for
Yeah.
a CFO or a CRO
Yeah.
kind of listening to this as to
Yeah.
really how to build that sort of streamlined workflow between the
Absolutely.
RevOps and the finance function?
I would say the one thing that is evolving is like, what are the KPIs from SaaS to the AI world? So before, ARR per FTE, blah, 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 all these kind of things that we used to look at and say, hey, there's a good company, there's a struggling company. Those are being rewritten now. So we'd go to the CFOs and the strategic finance folks to say, look, what KPI best represents this new world? And actually, how do we start tracking that to show our investors, to show the board that, look, despite this not being what you were seeing before, we still believe we're a super healthy business. So trying to be innovative and finding those things before they even kind of become normalized like they did in the SaaS world, things like magic number, rule of 40, all this type of stuff. It's going to evolve. So we need to think about that. The second thing I would say about the finance folks specifically is like, understand the voice of the customer, right? Understand why these models are actually important from the go-to-market and sales perspective, and don't just think margin first. Because I see a lot of CFOs that are, focused on keeping the business alive as they should from a gross margin perspective, but they often miss this side that there's a top-line growth angle to this, which could drive growth a lot quicker. And my view is that if they could focus on that a little bit more and do the puzzle of both of those sides of the equation, the companies will be in a better position to grow.
Great. Well, Saagar, this has been so insightful, and I can see why you have all of these great logos working with you guys to implement and scale their pricing. Thank you so much for sharing these insights with me, and leave it there.
Thanks, Rhea. Thank you.